The moment I walked into that ballroom, I heard her say it. Not quietly. Not by accident. She said it the way people do when they want to hurt someone, but still pretend they're being subtle. Sloane Whitmore leaned toward her bridesmaids, a champagne flute dangling from her perfectly manicured fingers, and whispered just loud enough for the words to travel. "Oh, great! The stinky country girl is here." Her friends giggled. Not polite laughs. Not awkward ones. The kind of laughter that comes from people who've never been told no in their lives. Designer dresses, glossy hair, teeth too white to be real. None of them looked at me directly. I wasn't worth the eye contact. I stood there at the entrance of the ballroom, letting the words sink in, letting the room swallow me whole. The music, the crystal chandeliers, the ice sculptures shaped like swans. Everything screamed luxury. Everything screamed you don't belong here. And the irony almost made me smile. Because what Sloane didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I owned the ground she was standing on. Every chandelier above her head, every piece of Italian marble beneath her heels, the bar pouring her champagne, the walls, the ceilings, the elevators, the entire building. 3 years ago, I had signed the deed to the Monarch Hotel. This wasn't just the venue for her engagement party. It was my flagship property, my pride and joy. And she had just called me a stinky country girl in my own house. Sloane didn't bother to turn around. To her, I was background noise, a blemish in an otherwise perfect evening. Some embarrassing relative who had crawled out of a small town to ruin the aesthetic of her engagement party. She didn't know my name. She didn't care to learn it. That was fine. I had learned a long time ago that people like Sloane are most dangerous when they think they're untouchable, and most entertaining when they're wrong. I took a slow breath and stepped further into the room. I felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over me. The jeans, the boots. My hair still smelled faintly of the countryside because I had driven through Millbrook earlier that day. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted to remind myself where I came from. My outfit probably cost more than everything Sloane was wearing combined, but you wouldn't know it by looking. That's the thing about real money. It doesn't scream. It doesn't need to. I caught my reflection in one of the mirrored columns. Calm face, steady eyes, no visible reaction. Good. I wasn't here to make a scene. Not yet. Across the room, Sloane stood beside my brother, Garrett, glowing like she had just won the lottery. Tall, beautiful, perfectly styled. She wore confidence the way some women wear perfume too much. And everywhere, Garrett looked proud. A little overwhelmed, the way men do when they think they've finally arrived. He had no idea he was holding a losing ticket. I scanned the room, cataloging everything the way I always do. Old habit. The staff moved smoothly, efficiently. My staff. Wesley Crane, my general manager, caught my eye from across the ballroom. Just for a second, he gave me a barely noticeable nod. Everything was running perfectly. I moved toward the bar and ordered a drink. The bartender smiled politely, unaware of who I was. I preferred it that way. People tell you more when they don't know you matter. Behind me, I heard Sloane laugh again. Sharp, calculated. She was working the room, air-kissing strangers, soaking up admiration like oxygen. She had that hunger in her eyes, the kind that isn't about love or happiness. It's about validation, about being seen, about winning. Let her have it. Tonight wasn't about revenge, not yet. Tonight was about patience, about watching, about letting people show me exactly who they were before they destroyed themselves. I spotted my mother across the room, Patricia Burns, holding court with a group of women who looked just like her, well-dressed, smiling too tightly, bragging without listening. She hadn't seen me yet. Or maybe she had and chose not to acknowledge it. That wouldn't have surprised me. Growing up, I learned early that invisibility can be a survival skill. I took a sip of my drink and leaned against a pillar, blending into the background, the country girl, the nobody, the embarrassment. And as Sloane continued to laugh, completely unaware that the walls around her belonged to me, one thought settled quietly in my mind. Never underestimate the person who knows exactly how small you think they are. Because while you're busy looking down on them, you'll never see what they're building right beneath your feet. Standing there in the corner of that ballroom, watching Sloane Whitmore laugh like the world had always belonged to her, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something older. Something deeper. The kind of ache that doesn't come from one cruel sentence, but from a lifetime of being reminded exactly where you stand. Because this wasn't the first time I'd been made to feel small, it was just the most public. I grew up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small it barely showed up on a map unless you zoomed in and really tried. The kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, where the biggest excitement of the year was the county fair, and where leaving town was considered either brave or foolish, depending on who you asked. Our house sat on a quiet street with peeling paint and a porch that creaked in the winter. It wasn't a bad childhood, not on the surface. We had food. We had heat. We had a roof over our heads. But inside that house, there was an unspoken hierarchy, and I learned my place in it very early. My brother Garrett was 3 years older than me, and from the moment he was born, he was golden. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. My parents spoke his name like a promise fulfilled. Garrett was everything I wasn't supposed to be, and everything I could never quite measure up to. If I brought home an A, my mother would smile politely and say, "That's nice," then mention that Garrett had gotten an A+ in the same class years before. If I made a team, Garrett had already been captain. If I dreamed too loudly, I was told to be realistic. If Garrett dreamed, he was ambitious. My mother, Patricia, had a way of looking at me that made me feel like a project she didn't quite understand and had no patience for. Not outright cruelty. That would have been easier. It was the constant comparison, the subtle disappointment, the feeling that I was always one step behind a finish line I'd never been invited to cross. There were moments, small ones, when I thought things might change. When I won a regional writing contest in high school. When I got into a decent college program. When my grandmother took my hand one afternoon and told me I was a fighter, a dreamer, the one who would make something of herself. But those moments never lasted. By the time I was 18, I understood something important. I wasn't failing my family. I was failing their expectations of who I was supposed to be, and those expectations had never included me shining too brightly. So I left. One suitcase, $200, a bus ticket to the city. No dramatic goodbye. No tears. Just a quiet decision made in the middle of the night while the house slept. I didn't leave because I hated Millbrook. I left because staying meant slowly disappearing. The city didn't welcome me with open arms. It chewed me up first. I lived in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and a radiator that screamed louder than my thoughts. I ate instant noodles so often I stopped tasting them. I worked jobs that left my hands raw and my feet aching. But for the first time in my life, every failure was mine. Every small win was mine too. Back home, they assumed I was struggling, and for a while, they were right, but there was something different about struggling when no one is watching. You stop performing, you stop apologizing, you learn. That's how I ended up cleaning hotel rooms. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't impressive, but it was honest work, and it taught me more than any classroom ever had. I learned how systems worked, how people cut corners, who actually held power and who just looked like they did. I watched managers talk themselves into bad decisions. I watched guests treat staff like furniture. I watched money move quietly behind the scenes. And while everyone else saw a cleaning lady, I saw an education. I worked my way up one position at a time. Front desk, assistant manager, manager. I saved every dollar I could. I made smart investments. I took risks when they scared me but made sense. I didn't announce my progress. I didn't post about it. I didn't call home to brag. Why would I? They never asked. To my family, I remained the struggling daughter, the one who left, the one who didn't quite fit, and over time, I realized something that hurt more than I expected. They were more comfortable with me being small. Standing in that ballroom now, years later, watching my mother laugh with Sloane's parents and my brother glow beside his perfect fiancé, I understood it clearly. This wasn't just about an engagement party. This was about a story they had been telling themselves for years. And I was never meant to change it. But stories have a way of unraveling, especially when the quiet girl everyone underestimated finally stops staying quiet. Leaving Millbrook didn't magically turn my life into a success story. There was no moment where everything clicked and the universe rewarded my bravery. What I found instead was silence. No one checking in, no one asking how I was doing. Just long days, longer nights, and the slow realization that if I was going to build a life, I was going to have to do it myself. That was how I ended up scrubbing bathtubs in a boutique hotel downtown. It wasn't the kind of place you saw on postcards. No grand lobby, no crystal chandeliers, just clean lines, soft lighting, and guests who expected perfection without ever thinking about the people who made it happen. I wore a uniform 2 sizes too big and pushed a cart filled with towels and cleaning supplies down endless hallways. To most people, I was invisible, but invisibility has its advantages. While I cleaned rooms, I listened. I noticed patterns, which guests complained the loudest, which managers bent rules when no one was watching, how inventory was tracked, how bookings worked, how pricing changed based on seasons, events, and demand. I watched how one bad decision could ripple through an entire operation and how one smart adjustment could quietly double profits. I didn't just clean rooms. I studied them. When a front desk position opened up, I applied. When an assistant manager role became available, I volunteered for every extra shift until they couldn't ignore me anymore. I didn't charm people. I didn't play office politics. I showed up early, stayed late, and learned everything I could get my hands on. People assumed I was ambitious because I wanted more money. That wasn't it. I wanted control. I wanted to understand the system so completely that no one could ever pull the ground out from under me again. By the time I was managing my first property, I had developed a habit that would shape the rest of my life. I stayed quiet. I let people underestimate me. I let them think I was lucky, or temporary, or easily replaceable. Meanwhile, I saved every spare dollar. I lived below my means. I invested cautiously, then boldly, then strategically. I didn't buy things to impress anyone. I bought time, knowledge, opportunity. My first property came when I was 28. It wasn't glamorous, a struggling hotel in a decent location with terrible management and unrealized potential. Everyone I talked to thought it was a bad idea, too risky, too much work, too much debt. They were right about one thing. It was a lot of work. But I understood hotels. I understood people. And I understood that potential is only invisible to those who don't know how to look for it. I turned it around in 18 months. By 30, I owned 3 properties. By 31, I had built Birch Hospitality from the ground up, 6 boutique hotels across the East Coast, each one carefully chosen, carefully managed, carefully grown. The Monarch was my flagship, the one I was proudest of, the one that represented everything I had built without anyone's help. And still, I didn't tell my family. Not because I was hiding, because I didn't need their approval anymore. They had spent years teaching me that my accomplishments only mattered if they fit into their narrative. So I built my own. I sent money home quietly, paid off the second mortgage on my parents' house, covered medical bills when my father needed surgery, utilities, groceries. I never signed my name, never asked for credit. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about doing what I could, from a distance, without reopening old wounds. They never asked where the money came from. Standing in the Monarch Hotel that night, surrounded by people who believed wealth was loud and obvious, I thought about how much effort I had put into being underestimated. The jeans, the boots, the lack of jewelry. It wasn't a costume. It was comfort. It was who I was. Across the ballroom, Sloan Whitmore laughed again, tilting her head just enough to let the light catch her necklace. My necklace. And for the first time that evening, something inside me shifted. I had spent years believing that staying quiet was the smartest move, that letting people think less of me gave me power, and most of the time, it did. But power also comes with responsibility. The Monarch wasn't just a building to me. It was proof. Proof that the girl who left Millbrook with $200 and a suitcase hadn't disappeared. She had grown sharper, stronger, smarter. And as I stood there, watching my brother celebrate a future built on assumptions and lies he didn't even know were lies yet, I realized something else. Staying silent had protected me, but it was also about to protect them. whether they deserved it or not. That was the night everything changed. The strange thing about success is that it doesn't erase old wounds, it just gives you a clearer view of where they came from. Standing there in the Monarch Hotel, surrounded by chandeliers and champagne, I felt both powerful and painfully exposed at the same time. I had built everything I ever dreamed of, and yet one glance from my mother could still make me feel like I was 12 years old again. She found me near the edge of the ballroom, exactly the way she always had by accident, but somehow still on purpose. Patricia Burns approached with a tight smile, the kind she reserved for situations she didn't fully approve of but was willing to tolerate. Her eyes swept over me, lingering on my boots, my jeans, my hair pulled back without effort or ornament. "Well," she said, drawing the word out, "it's nice that you could make it." Her tone suggested it was anything but. She glanced around quickly, as if afraid someone important might overhear us, then leaned in just enough to lower her voice. She asked why I couldn't have worn something more appropriate. This was a formal event, after all. Sloane's family was very refined. She stressed that word refined like it was something I'd missed a memo about. I told her I had come straight from work and didn't have time to change, which was true. I just didn't clarify that work meant overseeing a multi-million-dollar hospitality company and approving final details for the very event she was criticizing me at. She sighed, the familiar sound of disappointment she'd perfected over decades, and reminded me to try to make a good impression. Then she was gone. Just like that. No questions about my life, no curiosity, no warmth. 20 seconds of conversation, and I felt like a child again, standing in the kitchen while she praised Garrett for something I'd done first. I took a breath and let it pass. I had learned to do that, to let her words slide off me without cutting too deeply. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Garrett noticed me a few minutes later. Or maybe he noticed the empty space where I was standing. He smiled, the polite kind, and said he was glad I could make it. His eyes drifted past me almost immediately, scanning the room for Sloane or someone else he needed to impress. I asked how he was doing. He said he'd never been happier. Then he mentioned the necklace. Grandma's necklace. He said it casually, like it was a charming detail. Mom had given it to Sloane as an engagement gift, he explained, clearly proud of the gesture. Wasn't that generous of her? Sloane absolutely loved it. I felt the air leave my lungs. That necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a promise. My grandmother had held my hand in the hospital years ago, her voice thin but certain, and told me it was meant for me, because I was her dreamer, her fighter, the one who wouldn't give up. My mother had been there. She had heard every word, and she had given it away anyway. I looked across the room and saw it immediately, hanging around Sloane's neck, catching the light as she laughed with her friends. It looked wrong there. Like a piece of my past had been misplaced in someone else's story. Something sacred reduced to an accessory. I excused myself from Garrett before my face could betray me. The music was too loud, the lights too bright. I needed space. I walked toward the restroom, my heels clicking against the marble floor I owned, my thoughts spiraling despite myself. That's when I saw Franklin Whitmore. He stood in the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and tense. He didn't notice me as I passed. I slowed my steps, instinctively quiet, the way I'd learned to be growing up. He said they needed this wedding to happen, that everything depended on it, that the Burns family had money enough to cover their situation. He paused, listened, then said they just needed to get through the ceremony. After that, things would work out. He hung up and straightened his jacket, his public smile sliding back into place like a mask. I stood frozen for a moment, the words echoing in my head. What money? My parents weren't wealthy. Garrett made a decent living, but nothing extraordinary. There was no hidden fortune, no trust fund, no safety net. And then it hit me. For the past 4 years, I had been sending money home. Quietly, anonymously. Mortgage payments, utility bills, medical expenses. When my father needed surgery, I covered it. I never put my name on anything. I didn't want gratitude. I didn't want questions. My parents didn't know it was me, and in my mother's mind, there was only one logical explanation. Garrett. Of course, she thought it was him, her golden child, her success story, the son who could do no wrong. I could almost hear her voice, bragging to her friends about how responsible and generous he was, how he took care of his parents without making a fuss. The irony was almost laughable. So the Whitmores had done their research. They had seen a family whose bills were paid, whose house looked secure, whose son seemed successful, and they had made their move. Standing there in the hallway, my grandmother's necklace forgotten for the moment, I realized something important. This engagement wasn't just an insult, it was a setup, and my family was walking straight into it, completely unaware. Once the thought settled in my mind, it refused to let go. The Whitmores hadn't just stumbled into my brother's life by chance. They had chosen him, chosen my family. And suddenly, all the little things I had brushed off earlier in the evening began to rearrange themselves into a picture I didn't like at all. I went back into the ballroom with a different awareness, like someone who had just learned a magic trick and could no longer enjoy the illusion. I didn't drink much. I didn't talk much. I watched. Franklin Whitmore was no longer the relaxed, proud father of the bride he pretended to be. He checked his phone constantly, his jaw tightening every time the screen lit up. He laughed too loudly, then fell silent too quickly. Delilah hovered near him, her hand repeatedly brushing her necklace, adjusting her earrings, touching her wrist as if to reassure herself that everything was still there. Still real. And Sloane, perfect, polished Sloane, had something sharp behind her smile. It wasn't joy, it wasn't excitement, it was hunger, the kind that comes from knowing you're running out of time. I had seen that look before, in business partners trying to close a deal they couldn't afford to lose, in investors who smiled while panicking internally, in people who needed something badly but were pretending they didn't. An hour earlier I might have dismissed it as nerves. Now I knew better. I found a quiet corner near the bar and pretended to scroll through my phone while listening to fragments of conversations around me. Sloane's parents spoke in vague phrases about expansion and new opportunities. They dropped names without context. They promised introductions without specifics. Everything sounded impressive and hollow at the same time. That's when Sloane appeared beside me. She didn't announce herself. She just slid into my space, close enough that I could smell her perfume, expensive, overwhelming, intentional. She smiled like we were old friends, like we shared some private joke. "We should talk," she said lightly, "just the two of us." Her hand slipped around my arm, guiding me toward a quieter hallway near the restrooms. To anyone watching, it probably looked warm, inclusive, sisterly. The moment we were out of earshot, her grip tightened, and her smile vanished. "I know about you," she said. I didn't respond. I'd learned a long time ago that silence makes people uncomfortable. It gives them room to reveal themselves. She tilted her head, studying me like a puzzle she'd already solved. She said she knew I sent money home every month, that I liked to play the good daughter from a distance. She laughed softly and asked why someone who could barely afford their own apartment would do that for a family that didn't even like them. "Unless," she continued, lowering her voice, "you're trying to buy their love." There it was. The cruelty was casual, efficient, delivered with the confidence of someone who thought she had all the facts. She said it was pathetic, really, that I should stop pretending I mattered. She told me Garrett had explained everything to her. How I was always jealous, how I couldn't handle not being the favorite, how the family tolerated me out of pity. Each word was a small, precise cut. She leaned closer and told me she was going to marry Garrett, become part of this family. And honestly, she said, it would be better for everyone if I just stayed away. Nobody would miss me. I was dead weight. Then she smiled again, patted my arm like she was consoling a child, and walked away. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, my face calm. Sloane Whitmore thought I was broke. She thought the money came from Garrett. She thought she was speaking to someone with no leverage, no power, no place in this story. It was almost impressive how wrong she was. That was when Wesley found me. He approached quietly, his clipboard tucked under his arm, his expression serious in a way I had rarely seen. He asked if everything was all right. He called me Miss Burns out of habit, then quickly corrected himself when I gave him a look. "I think you should see this," he said. He handed me a folder. Inside were documents, financial records, court filings, news articles. The deeper I looked, the colder I felt. The Whitmores weren't just overstretched, they weren't unlucky. They were being investigated. Fraud, wire fraud, investment fraud. Their real estate empire was a house of cards built on lies and other people's money, and it was already collapsing. Wesley told me quietly that he dug up everything he could find. There were inconsistencies everywhere, shell companies, lawsuits quietly settled, names that appeared and disappeared across state lines. This engagement party wasn't a celebration, it was an escape plan. I took the folder and excused myself, walking out into the parking garage where the air was cooler and the lights flickered overhead. I leaned against my car and read every page slowly, carefully, forcing myself to stay grounded. The Whitmores were 6 months away from bankruptcy. Federal investigators were circling. Investors were asking questions they could no longer answer. And my brother, my oblivious, trusting brother, was their way out. They thought my family had money. They thought Garrett was their golden ticket. They had no idea that the only real wealth connected to the Burns family was standing in a parking garage, holding their entire operation in her hands. For the first time that night, I wasn't just hurt. I was afraid. Because if I did nothing, my family would be destroyed along with them. And if I acted, everything would change. There was no going back now. I sat in my car for a long time after that, the folder resting on the passenger seat like it weighed more than paper ever should. The parking garage was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of laughter drifting down from the ballroom above. An engagement party was happening just a few floors up. Champagne was still flowing, people were still smiling, and none of them had any idea that the ground beneath it all was already cracking. The documents didn't leave much room for interpretation. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad investment cycle. Franklin and Delilah Whitmore had been running a con for years. They took money from investors for developments that either didn't exist or were wildly overvalued. Early investors were paid off with funds from later ones, the oldest trick in the book. A Ponzi scheme dressed up in tailored suits and charity galas. They were careful. I'd give them that. Lawsuits quietly settled, companies dissolved and reformed under new names, properties shuffled between shell entities. On the surface, everything looked legitimate enough to pass a casual background check. But dig a little deeper, and the whole thing unraveled. I closed the folder and leaned my head back against the seat, staring at the concrete ceiling. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The woman who had called me dead weight was standing on a sinking ship and didn't even know it yet. The family that had mocked my boots and my jeans was weeks away from losing everything. There was a sharp, undeniable satisfaction in that thought. I won't pretend there wasn't. But it didn't last. Because as quickly as the anger flared, something heavier took its place. Garrett's face flashed in my mind, his awkward smile, the way he looked at Sloane like she was the answer to every question he'd ever had about his life. My mother's proud laughter. My father quietly enjoying a rare night out, unaware that his future was being negotiated without his consent. They had no idea. And if the Whitmores' plan worked even partially, my family would be the ones left holding the wreckage, financially, emotionally, publicly. When the truth came out, and it would, the fallout wouldn't be gentle. I could walk away. No one could blame me. After everything they'd put me through, it would almost feel justified. Let the Whitmores drain whatever they could. Let my family finally face the consequences of their blind trust and misplaced pride. The thought tempted me more than I was comfortable admitting. But then I remembered my grandmother's voice, soft but steady, calling me her fighter, the one who didn't quit. I remembered my brother teaching me how to ride a bike, running beside me until I found my balance. I remembered my mother sitting up all night when I had chickenpox, even if she later forgot what that kind of care meant. Family is complicated. You can be hurt by people and still love them. You can be furious and protective at the same time. And you can decide to act not because someone deserves it, but because you do. I picked up my phone and made the first call. Rebecca Thornton answered on the second ring. She always did. It was one of the many reasons I paid her what I did. I gave her a concise summary of what I had found and asked her how quickly she could verify it. She didn't ask questions. She didn't express shock. She just told me she'd call me back within the hour. That was the moment things became real. Next, I called Naomi Delaney, a a forensic accountant I'd worked with on a messy acquisition a couple of years earlier. Naomi had a mind that worked like a lockpick. She could look at a spreadsheet and tell you what someone was trying to hide. I sent her photos of the key documents and asked her to dig deeper, as deep as she could. Then I sat there and waited. Waiting is harder than people think. It gives your mind too much space. Doubt crept in. Was I overreacting? Was I about to destroy my brother's engagement over information that might not be complete yet? Was this really my responsibility? The phone buzzed. Naomi's voice was tight when she spoke, energized in that way people get when they uncover something big. She confirmed what the documents suggested. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme. But that wasn't the worst part. She'd run the Whitmore name through databases in other states. Arizona, specifically. Same pattern, same financial structure, different names. The bride's real name wasn't Sloan Whitmore. It was Sandra Williams. My grip tightened on the phone as she explained. The parents weren't her parents. They were partners, long-term ones. This wasn't their first attempt, and it wouldn't have been their last if they hadn't gotten sloppy. Different cities, different identities, same game. I laughed then. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only response left when reality becomes too absurd to absorb. These people had more identities than most actors have roles, and they were about to marry into my family under a name that wasn't even real. The phone buzzed again, a text from Garrett. He said something felt off, that Sloan avoided questions about her past, that Franklin kept disappearing. He asked if we could talk. I looked at the time. 5 minutes until 9. Franklin Whitmore was scheduled to make his big welcome toast, the moment designed to cement this alliance, to seal the deal. I stared at my brother's message for a long moment. Too late for warnings. Too dangerous for half-truths. If I spoke now, he might confront Sloan, and if Sloan caught wind of what I knew, she would run. They all would. No. This had to be done cleanly, publicly, irrefutably. I typed back a single sentence. I told him we'd talk after the toast. Then I opened the car door and stepped back into the warm night air. Inside the hotel, a lie was about to meet the truth, and there was no stopping it now. I walked back into the Monarch Hotel with a different energy than when I had left. Before, I had been quiet on instinct, careful, observant. Now, every step felt deliberate. The doors slid open, and the sound of the party rushed toward me, music, laughter, the clink of glasses like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. I spotted Wesley near the service entrance, his clipboard tucked under his arm, his posture alert in a way that told me he was already sensing trouble. He met my eyes and raised an eyebrow, a silent question. I gave him a small nod and motioned for him to follow me a few steps away from the crowd. "They're scammers," I said quietly. No preamble, no softening the words. All of them. The whole family. Wesley didn't flinch. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. He listened, absorbing every word as I gave him the briefest version of the truth fraud, fake identities, an investigation already underway. When I finished, he exhaled slowly and said he'd had a feeling something was off all night. I told him I needed the AV system ready. I told him that during Franklin Whitmore's toast at 9 o'clock, the guests were going to see a presentation they wouldn't forget. I handed him a USB drive. On it were scanned court records, financial statements, photos, timelines, everything Naomi and Rebecca had confirmed. Wesley looked at the drive, then back at me. "You're sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. He nodded once and disappeared toward the control room without another question. I moved back into the ballroom and found a place near the back where I could see everything without being seen. The room looked the same as before, but I noticed details I hadn't earlier. The way Franklin kept glancing toward the exits, the way Delilah clutched her purse like it held more than lipstick, the way Sloane's laughter sounded just a little too sharp, just a little too forced. Garrett stood beside her, smiling politely, unaware that his entire future was hanging by a thread. My mother chatted with Delilah like they were old friends. Two women bound together by appearances, neither realizing how fragile theirs were. My phone buzzed again. Garrett, asking where I was, saying he really needed to talk, that something about the Whitmores didn't sit right with him. I stared at the message longer this time. Part of me wanted to run to him, to pull him aside and tell him everything. To save him, the humiliation, the heartbreak. But another part of me, the part that had survived years of being ignored, knew that wouldn't work. If I warned him now, he'd confront Sloane. And Sloane would lie. She was good at that. She'd cry, deflect, twist the narrative. And if she sensed danger, she'd disappear. This had to happen where she couldn't escape it. I typed back a short reply. I told him to wait, that we'd talk after the toast. Across the room, Franklin Whitmore checked his watch and straightened his tie. 8:56. The DJ began lowering the music slightly, a subtle signal that something formal was about to happen. Guests began drifting toward the small stage, glasses refilled, smiles ready. I felt my pulse quicken, but my hands stayed steady. This wasn't fear, it was focus. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. Leaving home, cleaning rooms, being overlooked, sending money anonymously, being called dead weight by a woman who didn't even know my real value. Every quiet choice I had made had brought me here. The funny thing about patience is that it teaches you timing. At 8:58, Franklin stepped toward the stage. Delilah followed, her smile fixed, her eyes darting. Sloane squeezed Garrett's hand and leaned in to whisper something that made him laugh. The sight twisted something in my chest, but I pushed it down. Not now. The screens behind the stage flickered to life, displaying a slideshow of Garrett and Sloane, smiling at the beach, laughing over dinner, carefully curated moments designed to tell a story that wasn't true. I caught Wesley's eye across the room. He gave me the smallest nod. My phone buzzed again, a new message, this time from Rebecca. She confirmed what Naomi had found. The investigation was real, the warrants were active, and she had already contacted the lead investigator, Agent Carla Reeves. Agent Reeves was on her way. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and checked my watch. 8:59. Franklin took the microphone and cleared his throat. The room quieted, expectant. He thanked everyone for coming, his voice smooth, practiced. He talked about love, about family, about how honored the Whitmores were to be joining the Burns family. Every word was a lie. He raised his glass and smiled broadly. To love, he said. To family. To forever. I took out my phone and typed one word. The screens behind him flickered. For a split second, people assumed it was a technical glitch. The smiling photos vanished, replaced by a dense document stamped with official seals, a court filing, names, dates, charges. Franklin's smile froze. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people squinted at the screens, trying to understand what they were seeing. Franklin laughed nervously and said, "There must be some mistake." He turned toward the control booth, gesturing wildly. But the screens kept changing. Financial records, news articles, photos of a younger woman with the same eyes and a different name, Sandra Williams. Sloane's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Garrett stared at the screens, then at Sloane, then back again. I watched the moment his reality cracked open, the confusion giving way to understanding. My mother's face drained of color. Delilah's hand flew to her mouth. Franklin tried to step away from the stage, but two security staff quietly blocked his path. That was when I stepped forward. My boots echoed against the marble as I walked through the parted crowd. Faces turned, whispers followed. Wesley's voice came through the speakers, calm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please allow me to introduce the owner of the Monarch Hotel and CEO of Birch Hospitality." The silence was absolute. Miss Bethany Burns. And just like that, the invisible girl became impossible to ignore. I took the microphone from Franklin Whitmore's hand before he could decide whether to drop it or throw it. It felt strangely light, like it had been waiting for me all along. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the projector and the shallow, uneven breaths of the people closest to the stage. "Good evening," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the way my heart was pounding. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe everyone here deserves to know exactly what they're celebrating tonight." Behind me, the screens continued to rotate through documents, court filings, financial statements, headlines from Arizona, photos of Sloane, no, Sandra standing beside Franklin and Delilah under different names, in different cities, at different charity events. The evidence stacked up, undeniable and merciless. Franklin finally found his voice. He laughed, a sharp, panicked sound. He said this was absurd, that it was all fabricated, that I was a jealous sister trying to ruin my brother's happiness. He demanded the screens be shut off. They weren't. Sloane spun toward me, her face pale, her eyes blazing. She screamed that I was lying, that I was nobody, that I couldn't stand seeing Garrett happy. Her voice cracked as she talked, the polished confidence she'd worn all night splintering in real time. I smiled at her. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, just calmly. "That's interesting," I said, "because I'm curious how I managed to fake an ongoing federal investigation." A collective gasp rippled through the room. I gestured toward the screens again. "These records aren't rumors. They're public filings. Fraud, wire fraud, investment fraud. And the woman you know as Sloane Whitmore," I paused deliberately, "is actually named Sandra Williams." Garrett's head snapped toward Sloane. His face looked like it had been drained of blood. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked back at the screens as if hoping they'd change into something easier to understand. They didn't. At that moment, the ballroom doors swung open. 4 people in dark suits walked in, badges visible, expressions all business. The sound of their footsteps echoed louder than the music ever had. Agent Carla Reeves stepped forward, her gaze locking immediately onto Franklin. "Franklin Whitmore," she said evenly, "or whatever your real name is. You're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy, and multiple counts of investment fraud." Franklin tried to bolt. He made it about 10 feet before security intercepted him, and Agent Reeves placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Delilah collapsed into tears, mascara streaking down her face as she babbled about misunderstandings and explanations no one was listening to anymore. Sloane turned to Garrett, desperation pouring out of her. She begged him to believe her. She said they loved each other. She said his sister was destroying their lives out of spite. Her voice shook, raw and unfiltered. Garrett stared at her for a long moment. I watched something inside him break and reform at the same time. Then he stepped back, just one step. But it was enough. "I don't even know who you are," he said quietly. That was it. Sloane screamed then. She lunged toward me, rage replacing panic in an instant. Security grabbed her before she could reach the stage. As they dragged her away, she shouted that I was supposed to be nobody. That I was just a stinky country girl. I leaned close enough for only her to hear. "This stinky country girl owns the room you're standing in," I said softly. "And she's going to sleep just fine tonight." They escorted her out, still screaming, her designer dress wrinkled, her perfect image shattered beyond repair. The room sat frozen in stunned silence. I turned back to the crowd and took a breath. "Well," I said, "the catering's already paid for, and it seems like a shame to waste good food." Nervous laughter broke out. The DJ, bless him, started playing something upbeat. The engagement party was over. But the truth had finally arrived. The next hour felt unreal, like the kind of dream where everything moves too fast and too slow at the same time. The Whitmores, Franklin, Delilah, and the woman who had once answered to Sloane were escorted out in handcuffs, while half the room watched in stunned silence and the other half pretended very hard not to stare. Flashing lights reflected off the marble floors as the ballroom doors closed behind them, sealing the end of a story that had been built on lies from the very beginning. Inside, the air shifted. Shock gave way to whispers. Whispers turned into phones coming out of pockets. By morning, I knew this would be everywhere. Hotel mogul exposes con artists at brother's engagement party. Someone would probably make it sound dramatic. Someone else would make it sound cruel. I didn't care. The truth had a way of standing on its own. Garrett found me near the bar, his face pale, his eyes red. He looked like someone who had just woken up from a nightmare, only to realize it wasn't over yet. He asked how I knew, how I figured it all out. His voice cracked when he asked, and for the first time in years, he looked at me like I wasn't invisible. I told him the truth. I listened. I watched. I paid attention. I did the things I had always done while everyone else assumed I didn't matter. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. Then he said he was sorry. He said he knew it didn't fix anything, that it didn't erase years of treating me like an afterthought, but he was sorry. I believed him. We stood there in silence for a moment. 2 siblings who had lived in the same house but somehow grown up in completely different worlds. It wasn't a perfect ending, But it was a beginning. My mother approached next. Patricia Burns looked smaller than I remembered. The confidence she usually wore like armor was gone. She started to say she didn't know, that she never meant, but I stopped her gently and took out my phone. I showed her the records, years of payments, mortgage statements, medical bills, utilities, all from Birch Hospitality, all from me. I told her she had thought Garrett was supporting them, that she had bragged about her generous, successful son. I told her the truth. Her knees nearly buckled. She stared at the screen, then at me, tears filling her eyes in a way I had never seen before. She whispered my name like it was new to her, like she was finally seeing me. Before either of us could say more, there was movement near the dance floor. Something caught the light. I turned just in time to see my grandmother's necklace lying on the marble where it had been thrown during Sloane's meltdown. Garrett picked it up carefully and walked over to me. He placed it in my hand without a word. It felt warm. Right. Like something that had been waiting a long time to come home. The night eventually wound down. Some guests left quietly. Others stayed, determined to drink through the shock. The DJ kept playing. The champagne fountain kept flowing. Life, apparently, went on. 3 weeks later, I stood in my office at the Monarch Hotel, sunlight pouring through the windows, the city alive below. The Whitmores were finished. Federal charges, frozen accounts, no more aliases, no more escapes. Sandra Williams sat in custody, waiting for trial. Her bail was set so high that not even her fake wealth could touch it. The story made the rounds for a while. One headline called me the stinky country girl who owned the room. I framed that one and hung it on my wall. Garrett came to visit me a few days later. We went to lunch. A real lunch. We talked about our childhood, about the things we never said. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. My mother started therapy. She told me she wanted to understand why she had treated me the way she did. We agreed to take things slow. Healing doesn't happen on a schedule. This morning, I hosted a business breakfast at the hotel. Investors, partners, people with money and opinions. A young woman walked in looking nervous, clearly out of place. One man made a comment under his breath. I stood up, walked over, and introduced her as the recipient of the Birch Hospitality Scholarship. I told her story. Small town, big dreams, hard work. The room went quiet. She smiled at me like I had just handed her permission to exist. That's when I understood something fully for the first time. This wasn't just a revenge story. It was a reminder. People will always try to make you feel small for where you came from, what you wear, what you sound like, or how quietly you move through the world. Let them. While they're busy looking down on you, they won't see you rising. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel like you didn't belong, then don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe, share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because the quiet ones, we're everywhere.